Tony Bennett stood in the doorway of Giuseppe Benedetti's small workshop on Mulberry Street, holding a brass key that felt heavier than its size suggested. The old piano tuner had been dead for 3 days, and Tony was still trying to process the phone call from Giuseppe's nephew explaining that his uncle had left him something in his will. Not money, not a piano, not even one of the beautiful antique music boxes that had filled Giuseppe's shop for 40 years. Just a key. A mysterious brass key with an address etched into its surface. 1247 Thompson Street, apartment 4B. An address Tony didn't recognize in a part of Greenwich Village he rarely visited. Giuseppe Benedetti had been tuning Tony's pianos for 30 years. Every month, without fail, the elderly Italian man would arrive at Tony's apartment with his worn leather tool case and his gentle hands that could coax perfect pitch from the most stubborn instruments. He was a quiet man who spoke more through his work than his words, but over 3 decades he and Tony had developed the kind of friendship that exists between people who understand that some conversations happen without speaking. Giuseppe had never mentioned having anything to give Tony. They had never discussed wills or legacies or final wishes. Their relationship had been built on the simple exchange of service for payment, punctuated by cups of coffee and the occasional story about the old days when live music was king, and every respectable household had a piano that needed regular attention. But now, Giuseppe was gone, and Tony was standing outside a narrow brownstone on Thompson Street, wondering what his old friend could possibly have wanted him to find. The building was older than most in the neighborhood, probably dating from the 1920s, with the kind of worn brick facade that suggested decades of careful maintenance by people who couldn't afford major renovations, but took pride in their homes anyway. Tony climbed the narrow stairs to the 4th floor, his 97-year-old legs protesting the effort, and found apartment 4B. The key fit perfectly. Inside, Tony discovered something that took his breath away. The apartment was a shrine to American music history, but not the polished, sanitized version that appeared in museums and coffee table books. This was the real history, preserved with the obsessive care of someone who understood that the most important stories are often the ones that get forgotten. Every wall was covered with photographs, but these weren't publicity shots or red carpet images. These were candid photos of musicians at work, recording sessions, rehearsals, quiet moments backstage when the performance masks came off, and the human beings underneath were revealed. Tony recognized many of the faces, Sinatra looking tired between takes, Ella Fitzgerald laughing at something off camera, Count Basie explaining something to a young musician Tony didn't recognize. But it was the piano in the center of the room that made Tony's heart stop. It was a 1925 Steinway Model M, polished to a mirror shine despite its age, with ivory keys that glowed like pearls under the apartment's warm lighting. Tony had seen this piano before, but he couldn't remember where. Something about its particular grain pattern, the way the light caught the wood, felt familiar in a way that suggested profound emotional connection rather than mere recognition. On the piano bench sat an envelope with Tony's name written in Giuseppe's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter that would change everything Tony thought he knew about his own history. "My dear Anthony," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I have finally gone to join the great orchestra in the sky, and you have found the secret I have kept for 30 years. This piano belonged to your mother." Tony's legs gave out and he sank into the chair beside the piano, his mind reeling. His mother, Anna Benedetto, had died when Tony was only 10 years old. He had few memories of her, and those memories had been complicated by his father's reluctance to speak about her after her death. Tony had always assumed that his musical talent came from his father's side of the family, since that was where the Italian traditions and the appreciation for opera seemed to originate. But according to Giuseppe's letter, that assumption had been completely wrong. Anna was not just a housewife who happened to appreciate music, the letter continued. She was one of the most gifted jazz pianists of her generation. From 1920 to 1932, she performed under the stage name Anna Bell in the best jazz clubs in Manhattan. She played with musicians you would recognize: Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller. She was building a reputation as one of the finest accompanists in New York when she met your father and decided to give up her career for marriage and family. Tony stared at the piano, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he knew about his quiet, reserved mother. In his memories, she was always in the kitchen or tending to household duties, occasionally humming while she worked, but never displaying any particular musical ability. He had no recollection of ever seeing her play piano. Your mother made your father promise that you would never know about her performing career, Giuseppe's letter explained. She believed that jazz music was too wild, too unpredictable for a proper Catholic family. She wanted you to have a stable life, away from the uncertainties and temptations of show business. After she died, your father honored her wishes and never spoke of her musical past. The letter went on to explain how Giuseppe had known Anna during her performing years. As a young piano tuner, he had maintained the instruments in many of the clubs where she played. When Anna retired from music, she had asked Giuseppe to store her piano until she was ready to return to it. That day never came. Anna died of pneumonia in 1936, and the piano had been sitting in Giuseppe's care ever since. I have been waiting 30 years for the right moment to tell you this story, Giuseppe wrote. I wanted you to be old enough to understand that your mother's choice was not a betrayal of her musical gifts, but an act of love. She gave up her dreams so that you could have the freedom to pursue yours without the burden of family musical legacy. She wanted your talent to be your own, not an inheritance. Tony's hands trembled as he finished reading the letter. There was more, detailed information about Anna's performing career, copies of old newspaper reviews that praised her intuitive understanding of rhythm and melody. Even a few photographs of her at the piano, looking confident and radiant in a way Tony had never seen in the formal family portraits that his father had kept. But it was the final paragraph of Giuseppe's letter that brought tears to his eyes. Anthony, your mother left something for you on this piano. She recorded herself playing and singing lullabies when she was pregnant with you. She wanted you to have them someday, when you were old enough to understand the music as more than just entertainment. The recordings are in the piano bench. They are her gift to you. Not just the songs, but the knowledge that your musical soul came from her love. Tony opened the piano bench with shaking hands and found a small wooden box containing wax cylinders and an antique Edison phonograph. The cylinders were labelled in his mother's handwriting, "For Anthony, Songs for Sweet Dreams." With careful, reverent movements, Tony set up the phonograph and played the first recording. His mother's voice filled the apartment, warm, rich, and unmistakably the source of his own vocal qualities. She was singing Summertime, but her interpretation was unlike any version he had ever heard. It was intimate, personal, filled with the kind of love that only exists between a mother and her unborn child. As he listened, Tony began to understand things about his own musical development that had never made sense before. The way certain chord progressions felt instinctively right to him. The way he approached rhythm, not as something to be imposed on a song, but as something that emerged naturally from the emotional content of the lyrics. The way he had always been drawn to jazz standards, even when popular music was moving in completely different directions. These weren't learned behaviors or conscious artistic choices. They were inheritances from a mother he had barely remembered, gifts that had been passed down through blood and genetics, and the mysterious processes by which artistic sensibility travels from one generation to the next. But there was something else in the piano bench, a journal bound in worn brown leather, containing Anna's thoughts about music, motherhood, and the choice she had made to give up performing. March 15th, 1932, read one entry. I played my last professional gig tonight at the Cotton Club. Duke himself asked me to reconsider retiring, said I had a gift that shouldn't be wasted on domestic life. But he doesn't understand. The gift isn't being wasted, it's being planted. The music I won't play will live in my child. The songs I won't sing will find their voice through him. This isn't an ending, it's a transformation. Reading his mother's words, Tony finally understood the profound sacrifice she had made and the incredible faith she had shown in his potential. She had given up a flourishing career not because she stopped loving music, but because she loved it so much that she wanted to ensure it would continue through him. Another entry, dated just weeks before Tony's birth, revealed even more about Anna's hopes and fears. I dream about the kind of musician my son will become. I hope he'll have my ear for harmony and his father's determination. I hope he'll find success, but more than that, I hope he'll find joy in the music itself. I won't be able to teach him directly. Society doesn't approve of women like me, and I don't want him to carry the burden of my reputation. But I'll leave him clues. The way I hum while I work. The records I play when he's sleeping. The rhythm of my heartbeat when I hold him. Music will find its way to him because it's in his blood. Tony spent the next 4 hours reading every entry in his mother's journal and listening to every recording. Each song revealed another layer of her musical sophistication and her emotional depth. These weren't just lullabies. They were masterful interpretations of jazz standards, showcasing the kind of technical skill and emotional intelligence that only comes from years of professional performance at the highest level. But more than the technical abilities, what came through in every recording was the love. This was a mother singing to her unborn child, sharing her greatest gift in the most intimate way possible. Every note was infused with hope, with dreams, with the kind of unconditional love that shapes a person's entire life. As the afternoon light began to fade through the apartment's windows, Tony made a decision that surprised him. He was going to learn to play his mother's piano. At 97 years old, with Alzheimer's slowly stealing his memories, he was going to teach himself to play the instrument that his mother had mastered 70 years before his birth. It seemed impossible. Tony had been a vocalist his entire career, never showing any particular aptitude for instrumental music. His hands were stiff with age, his coordination was not what it once was, and his memory for new information was increasingly unreliable. But as he sat down at the piano bench and placed his fingers on the keys, something remarkable happened. The hand positions felt familiar. The weight of the keys, the distance between notes, the way his shoulders needed to align with his arms. It all felt like coming home. Tony began to pick out the melody of The Way You Look Tonight, one of the songs his mother had recorded for him. At first, his playing was halting and uncertain, but as he continued, muscle memory that he didn't know he possessed began to take over. His left hand found bass notes that supported his right hand's melody. His timing improved. The music began to sound less like fumbling and more like actual performance. It was as if his mother had been teaching him to play piano his entire life without him realizing it. Every time he had watched her hands while she cooked, every time he had absorbed the rhythm of her movements while she worked, every time he had unconsciously mimicked her gestures, he had been learning. The lessons had been transferred through observation and osmosis, waiting dormant until the moment when he would finally sit down at her piano and discover that her musical knowledge lived in his fingers. Over the following weeks, Tony returned to the apartment on Thompson Street every day. He spent hours at his mother's piano, teaching himself to play the songs she had recorded for him, and gradually expanding his repertoire to include pieces from her professional repertoire. The improvement was astonishing. Within a month, Tony was playing complex jazz arrangements with a sophistication that typically took years to develop. His musical knowledge as a vocalist translated seamlessly to the piano, and his mother's recordings provided a masterclass in jazz piano technique that no living teacher could have matched. But more importantly, playing his mother's piano was having an unexpected effect on his advancing Alzheimer's. The complex hand-eye coordination required for piano playing, combined with the emotional significance of connecting with his mother's memory, seemed to be slowing the progression of his cognitive decline. His doctors were amazed by the improvement in his mental acuity and his overall emotional well-being. Giuseppe Benedetti's nephew, Mario, visited Tony one afternoon and was stunned to find him playing a complicated Duke Ellington arrangement with confidence and style. "Mr. Bennett," Mario said, "my uncle told me about your mother, but I never expected. How did you learn to play like that so quickly?" Tony paused in his playing and considered the question. "I don't think I learned it, Mario. I think I remembered it. Your uncle gave me more than just a piano and some recordings. He gave me back a part of myself that I didn't know was missing." Mario nodded thoughtfully. "Uncle Giuseppe always said that music isn't something you learn. It's something you inherit. He said the best musicians aren't made, they're born with music already in their blood, just waiting for the right moment to be awakened." 3 months after discovering his mother's piano, Tony made another decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He announced that he wanted to give one final concert, not as Tony Bennett, the legendary vocalist, but as Anna Bell's son playing her piano and singing her arrangements. The concert was held at the Intimate Jazz at Lincoln Center venue, with an audience limited to musicians, music historians, and people who had known both Tony and Giuseppe Benedetti. Tony played his mother's 1925 Steinway, which had been carefully transported from the Thompson Street apartment for the performance. The program consisted entirely of songs that Anna Bell had either recorded for Tony or performed during her professional career. But these weren't nostalgic recreations of old music. They were living interpretations, filtered through Tony's decades of vocal experience and his newfound connection to his mother's musical legacy. The audience was witnessing something unprecedented. A 97-year-old performer discovering a completely new dimension of his artistic identity, drawing on gifts that had been passed down through genetics and love, but which had never been fully realized until this moment. The performance was transcendent. Tony's piano playing provided the perfect foundation for his vocals, creating an intimacy and musical coherence that he had never achieved even in his greatest collaborations with other musicians. This was music created by a single artistic consciousness, but informed by 2 generations of musical understanding. After the concert, jazz critics struggled to find language to describe what they had witnessed. How do you review a performance that exists outside normal categories of musical achievement? How do you evaluate artistry that represents not just individual talent, but the culmination of a mother's sacrifice and a son's lifelong unconscious preparation for a moment of discovery? But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the audience members who had known Anna Bell during her performing years. Several elderly musicians approached Tony after the show, some with tears in their eyes, to tell him that they had heard echoes of his mother's playing in his performance. "She would be so proud," said Samuel Morrison, a 94-year-old bassist who had played with Annabelle in the 1920s. "You didn't just inherit her talent, Tony. You inherited her soul. That piano was waiting 70 years for the right hands to play it again." In the months that followed, Tony continued to visit the Thompson Street apartment daily, spending hours at his mother's piano. But he made another discovery that Giuseppe's letter hadn't mentioned. Hidden in the back of the piano bench, behind sheets of music and old photographs, was a small notebook containing Anna's compositions. Original songs that she had written during her performing years, but never recorded. These songs were revelations. They showcased not just Anna's abilities as a performer and interpreter, but her gifts as a composer. The melodies were sophisticated and emotionally complex. The harmonies showed deep understanding of jazz theory, and the lyrics revealed a poet's sensitivity to language and rhythm. Tony began learning these original compositions, and in doing so, he discovered the final piece of his mother's gift. She hadn't just passed down her performing abilities, she had passed down her creative spirit. As Tony learned her songs, he began to understand the compositional choices she had made, the way she had structured melodies to support emotional content, the way she had used harmonic progressions to create specific moods and feelings. This understanding began to influence his own approach to song interpretation. Songs that he had been performing for decades suddenly revealed new depths when he approached them with his mother's compositional insights. His performances became more nuanced, more emotionally sophisticated, more musically adventurous. At an age when most performers are focused on preserving what they have achieved, Tony Bennett was experiencing a creative renaissance, discovering new dimensions of his artistry through a connection to family legacy that he had never known existed. Giuseppe Benedetti had given him more than just a piano and some recordings. He had given him a new understanding of himself as an artist and as a human being. The quiet Italian man who had tuned pianos for 30 years had been protecting and preserving a gift that was always meant to find its way to Tony, but only when the time was right. 6 months after that first visit to the Thompson Street apartment, Tony made a decision that completed the circle Giuseppe had begun. He donated the apartment to the Jazz Foundation of America, creating a scholarship program for young female jazz musicians who, like his mother, might face pressure to choose between family and career. But he kept the piano. Annabelle's 1925 Steinway found a place of honor in Tony's home, where he continued to play and learn and remember until his final days. The piano became his daily connection to the mother he had barely known, but who had shaped every note he had ever sung, every choice he had ever made as an artist, every moment of musical joy he had ever experienced. Giuseppe Benedetti's gift had been perfectly timed. At a stage of life when Tony was losing memories to Alzheimer's, he had been given access to memories that predated his birth, musical inheritances that connected him to family history and artistic legacy in ways that transcended conscious recollection. The brass key that had felt so heavy in Tony's hand that first day had unlocked more than just an apartment. It had unlocked an understanding of himself that was both deeply personal and universally meaningful. The knowledge that artistic gifts are never really individual achievements, but rather the culmination of generations of love, sacrifice, and hope passed down through family lines in ways that are often invisible until the moment when they are finally revealed. Annabelle's music lived on in her son's voice. And now, thanks to Giuseppe Benedetti's 30 years of careful preservation, it lived in his hands as well. The piano tuner's gift had restored not just a piano, but a connection between generations that time and circumstance had severed. proving that love and music have their own ways of transcending death and finding their way home. But the story of Giuseppe's gift had one more surprise waiting for Tony, one that would complete his understanding of the care and planning that had brought him to his mother's piano. 2 weeks after establishing the scholarship fund, Tony received a visit from Dr. Margaret Chen, a music therapist researching musical inheritance and cognitive health. She had heard about Tony's remarkable recovery of piano skills and wanted to understand the neurological mechanisms behind such rapid learning in elderly patients with dementia. Mr. Bennett, Dr. Chen explained as she watched him play his mother's piano, "What you've accomplished defies conventional understanding of musical memory. The speed at which you've developed these skills suggests the neural pathways were already established, preserved in your brain for nearly a century without conscious access." Tony paused his playing. "What do you mean by preserved?" Recent research suggests that when children are exposed to complex musical patterns in utero and during early development, their brains create neural structures that can remain dormant for decades. Your mother's music didn't just influence your vocal development, it shaped your brain architecture in ways that made you predisposed to piano playing. Over several months, Dr. Chen's interviews revealed remarkable details about how Annabelle's musical knowledge had been passed to her son. Tony's breathing patterns matched those of classical pianists rather than typical vocalists. His hand movements while conducting showed piano-specific finger independence. Even his earliest memories contained sophisticated harmonic progressions disguised as simple lullabies. "Your mother was teaching you piano without either of you realizing it," Dr. Chen concluded. "She embedded jazz piano fundamentals into your daily life. When you sat at her instrument, you weren't learning new skills. You were accessing skills downloaded into your neural system decades ago." Tony's brain scans showed activity patterns virtually identical to pianists who had been playing for 70 years. Despite consciously playing for less than a year, his brain displayed the neural architecture of a master musician. "This suggests something profound about musical inheritance," Dr. Chen explained. "Your mother didn't just pass down abilities through genetics. She actively programmed your developing brain with the skills she wanted you to have." Understanding this depth of his mother's gift inspired Tony to expand the scholarship fund, working with Dr. Chen to establish a research initiative documenting musical family legacies, especially those of female musicians lost to history. Giuseppe's apartment became headquarters for this initiative. The walls expanded to include images from dozens of forgotten female musicians. The apartment became a shrine not just to Annabelle, but to an entire generation of women whose musical gifts had been preserved through unconventional channels. On the anniversary of discovering his mother's piano, Tony held a special concert at the Thompson Street apartment, broadcast live online. The program featured Annabelle's original compositions for the first time, sharing music that had waited nearly a century for its debut. The response was extraordinary. The Jazz Foundation received donations from musicians worldwide. Record companies requested releases of Annabelle's compositions. Music historians sought access to the archive. 6 months later, Tony received documents from Italy that provided Giuseppe's final story. Giuseppe hadn't just been Annabelle's piano tuner, he had been her accompanist during her earliest gigs, a young musician deeply in love with her but never courageous enough to express his feelings. When Anna chose marriage over performing, Giuseppe had been heartbroken. But instead of bitterness, he channeled his love into a lifelong commitment to preserving her musical legacy. For 70 years he had maintained her piano, protected her recordings, and waited for the right moment to ensure her gifts would be recognized. Giuseppe had never married, never had children. His life had been dedicated to preserving the legacy of the woman he loved from afar, ensuring her sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. The brass key hadn't just been a gift from an old friend. It had been the culmination of a 7-decade love story, a final act of devotion ensuring Annabelle's music would reach her son when he needed it most. Tony wept learning this final piece. The quiet piano tuner who had cared for his instruments for 30 years had been protecting the most precious gift Tony would ever receive, waiting patiently to complete a love story begun in 1920s Manhattan jazz clubs. Giuseppe had given Tony more than musical legacy. He had provided a masterclass in selfless love that transcends personal desire and transforms into lifelong service to something larger than individual happiness. Annabelle's piano still sits in Tony's living room, where he plays daily as memory allows. The music carries combined legacies of 3 people: a mother who found ways to pass down gifts despite societal limitations, a son who discovered those gifts when needed most, and a man who spent his life ensuring love. And music would triumph over time and circumstance. The piano tuner's gift continues resonating, proving that the most important inheritances often take a lifetime to receive and understand, and that true love sometimes expresses itself not through possession but preservation, not through speaking but patient silence, not through personal fulfillment but through ensuring others discover the gifts they were always meant to receive.